Disabilities and performances for young audiences. In my sophomore year of high school, I was in a production of The Cat in the Hat at the Springer Opera House. When we were cast in this show, we were told that we would be doing a performance for children with sensory disabilities. And at the time, I had no idea what this was. So I began to do research. I found that the Starr Institute for Sensory Processing Disorders defines a sensory disability as a disability where sensory signals either don't get detected or don't get organized into appropriate responses. So with this in mind, I began to look at other children's theater productions to see what they were doing for this audience. But what I found is that most children's theater productions have sensory elements, whether it be lighting, sound, or audience interaction, that can be overstimulating and potentially frightening to children with sensory disabilities. And Dr. Winnie Dunn, professor and chair of the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Kansas Medical Center, says that children with sensory disabilities have either a high or low neurological threshold. So the children who are most affected by these type of productions are the children with a low neurological threshold. So, looking at how many children's theater productions were not serving this audience made me wonder what was causing this issue. And I found it comes down to ableism. Merriam-Webster describes ableism as discrimination or prejudice against individuals with disabilities. However, a 2009 study by Ben Sasson, Carter, and Briggs Gowan, published in the U.S. National Library of Medicine, found that 1 in 6 kids have some type of disability. So this means there is a huge demographic that is not being served by theater for young audiences. So, with that being said, you might be wondering, or with that being said, I'd bring it to my question, which is, how can theater for young audiences be better utilized to serve children with disabilities and break down the systemic ableism present in the field of theater? So before I move on, I'd like to unpack my question a little bit. I've chosen to use the term children with disabilities because this describes a disability as a trait of the person and not a defining feature. I've also chosen sensory disability specifically because this is a fairly newly researched area in the field of theater, and I'd like to look into it more. So with this question, I've come up with the thesis: consciously crafting performances for young audiences for children with disabilities will challenge ableism in theater. So with that, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, children with disabilities are already at a disadvantage in our society. According to UNICEF research from 2013, children with disabilities are at a greater risk of being poor and at a higher risk of being excluded from emergency services. Discrimination happens all across society, but there are some examples in public education. The World Bank and Global Partnership for Education found the gap between children who completed primary school with and without disabilities in girls is 15% and in boys is 18%. Children in special needs programs are also significantly more likely to face abuse, according to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Another example of discrimination for children is in children's sports teams. According to a study published in the U.S. National Library of Medicine, found evidence of worsening teasing and exclusion by peers with kids with disabilities in children's sports teams. So overall, this proves that there is a disability gap happening in our society, which causes feelings of separation and exclusion from children with and without disabilities. And these experiences don't end here. They carry into the theater experience as well, which brings up the question, is theater ableist? Theater claims to promote empathy and connect us to a basic human need to belong. However, it is filled with ableist tendencies. One example is in professional casting, which has a history of ableism. The first actress on Broadway in a wheelchair was Ali Stroker in Spring Awakening, and this was only 4 years ago. There are also ableist representations of characters with disabilities in theater, where they are either represented as useless and weak in the cases of Tiny Tim, or twisted and wicked like Richard III. So in order to break down ableism in theater, which needs to be done, the perfect medium has been theater for young audiences. And this is because TYA, or Theater for Young Audiences, focuses on make-believe and a willingness to use imagination to think outside of the box. So this is a community more willing to think and explore ideas outside of the norm, which would include sensory-inclusive theater. So now I would like to move on to my methodology. So I will be looking at theater for young audiences through the lens of special education and ableism. So what this means is I will be looking at what scholars in these areas have to say and how I can apply it to TYA. So now I'd like to move on to my case studies. I will be examining 3 theaters and how they use methods to include children with sensory disabilities in their season. The first is the Springer Opera House in Columbus, Georgia. The next is the Alliance Theater in Atlanta, Georgia. And finally, the Oily Cart Theater in London, England. So the first theater I will be looking at is the Springer Opera House and their production of The Cat in the Hat. So for this show, one show in the run was adapted for a sensory audience. And this includes lighting and sound was dimmed, audience interaction was limited to a pre-show, which means beforehand the children were able to meet the cast, see the props, and see the set to avoid any surprising moments, and the tickets were discounted. I found most of my information through conducting a survey with Sally Baker, who is the Springer's Director of Education. She says, "I guess what I'm afraid of is bringing an audience, a sensory audience, and giving them a show that would be alarming or upsetting in some way. So this brings up Springer's main method of adaptation, which is caution. They want to take any elements that might be frightening or overstimulating and remove them to avoid this situation." So now I'd like to dive into this method. This is a great way to open up the community to inclusive theater. And through this show, they actually developed a relationship with behavioral specialists Diane Pope and Austin McKee. And adaptations to the show specifically is an effective method, but it doesn't completely close the gap. Sally Baker recognizes that the Springer still has a long way to go. She claims they are at a 1.5 out of 10 on their ability to include this audience. And this is because children with and without disabilities are not seeing the same show. They're not in the theater together, experiencing this show together, which is similar to what special educators call a pull-out classroom. So overall, this is an effective method, but it doesn't close this disability gap. And this is proven in a study performed by Patricia J. Rhea, published in Outcomes for Students with Learning Disabilities and Inclusive and Pull-Out Programs. This study clearly demonstrated that children with disabilities included in general education classrooms achieved better outcomes on some measures than did their peers in pull-out programs and comparable outcomes in others. So what this proves is that inclusion works. By putting children in the same classroom together, or in this case, the same theater, they will raise each other to higher standards and achieve higher and learn more. So now I'd like to move on to the Alliance Theater and their production of La Tortuga and the Hare. So in this show, accommodations for specific children were made ahead of time, but no changes were made to the show itself. And these accommodations included making families aware of the sensory elements they would be experiencing and providing social narratives, which are packets that let the kids know ahead of time, I will park in this parking garage, I will buy my tickets from this booth, so that there is nothing that's surprising and potentially frightening or overstimulating. And they encourage audience interaction and response. So this means they're friendly to outbursts or to any children who might run up on stage and decide to join the show in that moment. They also engage with multiple sensory elements, including food, physical objects, live music, and dance. So what this means is stimuli is not concentrated in intense visuals, but through the immersive process. So I found most of my information through conducting an interview with Olivia Aston Bosworth, who is the Alliance's Family Programs Manager. In her experience, she found that people with disabilities want to be able to go to anything anyone else goes to. Some do not want their own special program. So this brings us to Alliance Method, which is no adaptations to the show itself, but for everyone to experience the same show with some prep work. So now I'd like to dive into that method. They have one show for everyone, children with and without sensory disabilities, which means everyone will be included in the same theater during the show. Olivia Aston Bosworth says she wants people to let go of the notion that everyone will sit and watch this precious moment we've created. So she wants audience interaction and to really encourage outbursts or anything that the kids might do during the show. However, there are still improvements to be made. Olivia claims they're at a 7 out of 10 on their ability to include these audiences, and that's because there are still moments that can be overstimulating. However, she hopes the audience is well prepared. But this can still be an issue, as proven in Whitney Ellenby's Washington Post article, where he claimed bringing his child to a non-adaptive performance of The Lion King resulted in overstimulation, outbursts, forced leaving, and a collective disapproval that such a parent would dare bring this type of child to the theater. So, this brings us to a comparison between the Alliance and the Springer. The Alliance provides an equal opportunity for all children to see the same show, but at a risk of overstimulation. And the Springer does not provide this equal opportunity, but they do cut back on the risk. So now I'd like to move on to my third and final case study, which is the Oily Cart Theater and their production of Mirror Mirror. So every show in this run is created with disabilities in mind. This is not adapted from some pre-existing show, but created for this audience specifically. Various senses are engaged, including sight, sounds, and personal interaction, and the audiences are limited to 6 children and 6 caretakers. There are also 3 rooms offered. The first is the Oasis, where children are familiarized with elements from the show. The next is the Palace of Beauty, where the show takes place. And the third is chill out rooms, which are calm down spaces for when the show becomes too overstimulating, so children can step out and remove themselves from the show until they feel prepared to rejoin the experience. And this is the same room as the Oasis, so it's not a new, surprising room, but a room that they're already familiar with. So I found most of my information from a study called Mirror Mirror, an evaluation for Oily Cart. This study shows that the variety of material resources and strategies used created a multi-sensory experience that was tailored to the participants' needs. So this is Oily Cart's method. They want to individualize their show to better serve every audience member. So in the moment, if an actor sees that a child is becoming too overstimulated, they can change it right then to better serve their individual needs. So now I'd like to dive into this method. They have one show for children with disabilities. So this means they will not have children with and without disabilities included in the same audience. And this can be an issue, as proven in a study by Louise Holt, who recommended inclusive learning and found that by providing children with the opportunity to learn together, in all senses of the term, establishes scope for children to develop webbed connections across similarities and differences, and for an acceptance of mind-body difference to become part of the histories, both conscious and unconscious, that influence all identities. So by learning together in the same theater, children can adapt their perceptions of disabilities. Oily Cart doesn't currently offer this opportunity, and the Springer doesn't either. The Alliance does, but at the risk of overstimulation. So going back, Oily Cart has less of a focus on plot and more of a focus on experience. So this isn't necessarily a linear storytelling, but more of an immersive process. And finally, this is not an adaptation, but a mindful creation. So like I said, they're not trying to adapt the pre-existing show to be sensory friendly, but creating a show for this audience specifically. So with all of that being said, what can we conclude? Well, I found that this is a complex issue that no one-size-fits-all concept solves. There are so many factors to consider, and each child has individualized needs, so it's nearly impossible to say one thing can work for everyone. However, I want to go back to my question and readdress that. My question was, how can theater for young audiences be better utilized to serve children with disabilities and break down the systemic ableism present in the field of theater? And my solution is that theater for young audiences can be better utilized to serve children with disabilities and begin to break down ableism through awareness and inclusion in the theatrical experience. And some methods of inclusion I found through my case studies. The first is adapted sensory stimuli from the Springer Opera House. So this means dimming lighting and sound to be more friendly. The next is preparation and diverse audiences from the Alliance. So making the families aware ahead of time what will be happening and putting children of all abilities in the same audience together to experience the show. And finally, mindful creations from Oily Cart. Instead of trying to adapt shows to make them more sensory friendly, I believe people should find shows and create them with this audience in mind. So now where do we go from here? Well, I believe all TYA programs have the opportunity to create theater for children with disabilities in mind. Next, I believe there should be performances for adults as well as children. Most of the sensory performances I found were for ages 0 to 18 with a focus on 0 to 5. So this means when adults with sensory abilities want to go to the theater and find a sensory friendly experience, this is not as much of an option as it is for children. And finally, including theater creators with disabilities in the process. I could only find this out specifically from 2 of my theaters, but of those 2 theaters, there was not one person with disabilities on their creative process. And after all, they know better than anyone what works and what doesn't. So, thank you so much for listening, and I would love to take any questions.
Sounds like one of the keys that you suggest here is the willingness and the ability to adapt to the audience. What does that do potentially to the technical aspects of a show? I'm thinking script, cues, lighting,
Right.
which all are painfully planned out oftentimes ahead of time.
Well, a lot of things, the lighting and sound won't have to change. It's more about the interaction, which is more present in theater for young audiences, but I've seen a lot more of it in adult theater lately. So it's not necessarily changing the script, but just being more aware of how the interaction to the audience can affect people.
Thank you.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you use the term people with disabilities on purpose in your presentation. I know a lot of different disability communities. I'm gonna share that I'm autistic, and so I'm very well versed within the autistic community, especially on the internet. And I've learned over the past few months that a lot of different disability communities have different thoughts on whether to use person first or identity first language.
Right.
I personally think, at least for autism, that identity first is the way to go, because when you say that I have autism or I have a disability or that I'm a person with a disability, that makes it sound like it's a disease or that, it's a peripheral, something I could lose at an airport,
Right.
and that's not really the case. It's part of who I am, and I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
And so that's what
I would love to talk to more people and find out a better word. I engage with some conversations
Yeah.
online.
I think the best thing to do is to ask.
Yeah, definitely. So I'd love to hear a wider range of people's views on that. Yes.
So you talked about how the Oily Card Theater creates shows specifically for children with disabilities. Is there anything preventing them from allowing children without disabilities to come to those shows?
Not at all, but the thing is they limit the audience to such a small size that they really only accept children into the audience who have disabilities.
Okay.
So I think it would just be more of, they have such an individualized method, so it is important to have a small audience, but more of being aware of how they can include people of all abilities in the audience together. Yes?
Do you think we'll get to a point that plays will have a caption or maybe a label saying this show has been adapted, or so that parents know this show has been adapted for
I think,
special needs?
yeah, that would be great. I know a lot of theaters do that, but these are mostly theaters who have separate performances, so they'll only let you know in the label if it's that performance. So I would love if they started letting everyone know that all of their shows were sensory adapted. Yes?
Yeah, so with this research, what would you like to give to the community and share with them in the future of theater?
Yeah, I would just love to share with them how important this is and the impact it can make, and how it's really so easy to be able to include an entire new demographic just with a few changes. So just making sure theater companies know how simple it is and how much of an impact it can really make. If there are no further questions, I just want to thank everyone so much.